What's the difference between a black redneck and a white redneck?
Color.
Same kind of people, same attitudes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and same kind of results. One of the things I point out in this book is that, you know, as late as the First World War, when mental tests were given in the Army, there were whites from any number of southern states who scored lower on those tests than blacks from northern states. So that anyone who comes out of that culture is likely to score lower on mental tests, to do less well in intellectual areas, whether they're black or white.
Over 30 books published. How important is this book to you?
Probably, it may be the most important, because there are so many misconceptions about racial and ethnic issues that just straightening out the misconceptions is a major task in itself. I don't reach any kind of policy conclusions in this book, because, as I say, it's a full-time job to get the facts straightened out. So I can write a column in a newspaper aimed at the general public, and there'll be extremely few misunderstandings of what I said. I can say the same things in a book that's aimed at intellectuals, and there'll be incredible twists and turning. Well, he seemed to say this further than that. I remember one huge review trying to figure out the implications of ethnic America. What made it a farce was that the last chapter of the book is titled Implications. So you don't have to guess what the implications I drew. They're right there. But I strongly suspect the person who wrote the review never got that far.
Black rednecks, who are they?
These would be blacks who came out of the Southern culture and who carried that culture with them north into the urban ghettos and into the ghettos of the South, for that matter. And who have not moved out of that culture since. Over the years, both blacks and whites have moved away from that culture. But in the poorest and worst of the ghetto areas, there are lots of people who have not. And these kinds it's a culture which didn't do whites any good, and it's certainly not doing blacks any good today. And the tragedy is that people regard this culture as somehow the authentic black culture, and therefore you're not to interfere with it. It's to be allowed to, and so they're cheering people on. It reminds me of a scene in the Blue Max where this general is encouraging this daredevil pilot to do all kinds of wild stunts, you see, knowing that the guy's going to kill himself if he keeps doing this, and therefore the general will be rid of a political problem. Now, I don't think that the white liberals are doing this deliberately, but I think the net results are the same. They are cheering blacks on and doing things that are absolutely self-destructive.
What's the difference between a black redneck and a white redneck?
Color.
Same kind of people, same attitudes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and same kind of results. One of the things I point out in this book is that, you know, as late as the First World War, when mental tests were given in the Army, there were whites from any number of southern states who scored lower on those tests than blacks from northern states. So that anyone who comes out of that culture is likely to score lower on mental tests, to do less well in intellectual areas, whether they're black or white. Slavery was much bigger and involved infinitely more people than people have realized. It was not confined by race. It was not defined by race or created by race. It existed for thousands of years. A history professor had a student come up to him and ask him, well, when did slavery begin? And he said, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, when did freedom begin? Because slavery existed as long as we have any records. And from archaeological finds, we realize that people were enslaving other people before they could read and write. So that's always existed, and it's existed all over the world. The number of white people enslaved by pirates in North Africa was greater than the number of Africans brought to the United States. You know, and yet that's not even mentioned in most of the discussion. So I tried to look at slavery as a worldwide phenomenon. And it's something that's lasted for thousands of years. I also tried to ask the question, why did it end? It ended here because of a civil war, but it didn't end anywhere else because of that. It took over 100 years to root it out. And again, the literature, there's tons, you can find the shelves groaning with books about the United States, the Western Hemisphere, and Africans, but virtually nothing about the rest of it. This book about the Europeans enslaved by North African pirates came out in 2003. By 2004, you couldn't find a copy. It had, for all practical purposes, gone out of print. There was just no interest in it. Racism in the United States grew out of slavery, but slavery didn't grow out of racism. The Europeans enslaved other Europeans for centuries before the first African was ever brought to the Western Hemisphere. that wherever there were people that were vulnerable for whatever reason, those were the people that were preyed upon. Even though for most of history, those who enslaved and those who were slaves were the same race.
In your opinion, what has to be done in the black schools or among black students in order to bring them up?
One, you get rid of the things that are dragging them down. You stop saying that speaking black English, is just as valid and all that kind of stuff. It may be just as valid to linguists and so forth, but the fact is, if you talk that way, you're not likely to get into med school, you're not likely to do very much in your life.
If you were still living 50 years from now, what would you predict the black race in this country would be?
Oh, wow.
I mean, based on trends that you've seen in the last 20, 50 years.
It could go either way. If the current trends continue, it's going to be a disaster. But there's evidence that the current trends are not unchallenged. People from time to time ask me to mention some black conservative writers. And I tell them, 30 years ago, I could have told you Walter Williams and me. And today, I can't even keep track of them all. They're all over the place. They're in the media, they have their own shows, they write columns, they write books, and I learn about them, from nowhere they suddenly appear. So there is this counter trend going on, and everything depends upon which wins out in the end.